She told me she needed freedom to dance through life, so I gave her exactly what she asked for. My wife Savannah had always been independent, but everything changed when she started her new job at a graphic design studio in downtown Memphis. I was working as a long-haul truck driver, spending weeks on the road hauling freight across the Southeast, and I thought her excitement about the new position was just natural career enthusiasm. What I didn't realize was that her newfound independence came with a dance partner named Dominic, her male coworker who quickly became her self-proclaimed best friend and creative inspiration. The first few months seemed harmless enough. She'd mention grabbing lunch with the team or staying late to work on projects, and I supported her ambitions completely. I'd been driving trucks for 8 years, working my way up from local deliveries to cross-country routes, and I understood the importance of building workplace relationships and professional networking. But then came the Friday nights that would define the end of our marriage, and looking back, I should have recognized the pattern immediately. Every week, like clockwork, Savannah would spend hours getting ready, selecting her most attractive outfits and perfecting her makeup while I sat at our kitchen table eating takeout Chinese food alone, still wearing my work clothes and smelling like diesel fuel after driving for 12 hours straight. When I asked where she was going all dressed up, she'd wave her hand dismissively and announce she was going dancing for freedom with Dominic, claiming it was essential for her mental health and creative energy that I apparently couldn't provide. The routine became painfully predictable. I'd watch her transform herself into someone who looked ready for a romantic date while she explained that traditional married couples who stayed home every weekend were trapped in suffocating domesticity and lacked the sophisticated understanding of personal growth that she and Dominic shared. I tried expressing my discomfort with the arrangement multiple times, pointing out that most married couples might find it unusual for a wife to regularly go out dancing alone with another man until 2 or 3 in the morning, especially when her husband was home after being gone for weeks. Savannah's response was always the same dismissive lecture about how I was being controlling and possessive, that I was trying to cage her free spirit like some kind of jealous prison warden who couldn't handle a strong, independent woman exploring her authentic self. She'd lecture me about how she refused to be one of those wives who gave up their identity just because they had a ring on their finger, conveniently ignoring the fact that I'd never asked her to give up anything except maybe some basic respect for our marriage boundaries and consideration for my feelings. The irony wasn't lost on me that she talked constantly about freedom while I was literally driving across the country for weeks at a time, giving her all the space and independence any person could possibly want. During these conversations, she'd reference articles she'd read about modern relationships and progressive marriage dynamics, always featuring quotes from Dominic about how enlightened people understood that love meant supporting each other's individual journeys without restrictions or traditional expectations. The breaking point came on a particularly brutal Friday night when I'd driven 18 hours straight to get home for what I thought would be a quiet evening together after being on the road for 2 weeks hauling furniture from North Carolina to Texas. I walked into our house exhausted and looking forward to reconnecting with my wife, only to find her applying lipstick in the hallway mirror while wearing a dress that cost more than I made in a day of driving and heels that suggested she had no intention of actually dancing. When I asked if we could maybe spend one Friday night together since I'd been gone for so long and had missed her terribly, she looked at me like I'd suggested we burn down the local community center and cancel Christmas. She explained with exaggerated patience that her freedom dancing sessions with Dominic were non-negotiable therapeutic experiences that helped her maintain her sense of self in our marriage, and that if I couldn't handle her need for independence and creative expression, maybe I should seriously consider finding my own freedom instead of trying to control her every move like some kind of insecure caveman. The way she said it, with that cold certainty in her voice while checking her appearance one final time in the mirror and grabbing her purse, made it clear this wasn't really about dancing or freedom or creativity. It was about having a marriage that accommodated her desire to essentially date another man with my full permission and financial support while I played the role of the understanding husband who funded her lifestyle and pretended not to notice how she lit up when Dominic texted her, or how she never looked at me the way she looked at her phone when he was messaging. That night, watching her leave for another evening with Dominic while I sat alone in our living room, I realized she was issuing me a challenge disguised as relationship advice, and for the first time in months, I decided to take her suggestion seriously and consider what my own freedom might actually look like without someone who clearly valued her dance partner's company more than her husband's presence after weeks of separation. I interpreted Savannah's challenge about finding my own freedom exactly as literally as she'd intended, and by the time she returned from her latest dancing session with Dominic, I'd already set the wheels in motion for the most efficient liberation operation of my trucking career. The moment her car pulled out of our driveway that Friday night, I grabbed my phone and started making calls to the only people I trusted completely, my fellow drivers who understood the value of loyalty, hard work, and keeping your word when someone needed help. First call went to Wyatt, my buddy who drove a pickup truck for a local construction company and owed me a favor from when I'd helped him move his elderly mother out of her foreclosed house last winter during one of the worst ice storms Memphis had seen in decades. Second call was to my younger brother Cole, who worked nights at a warehouse and had always been ready to help family without asking questions or offering unwanted relationship advice that wouldn't change anything anyway. Third call was to Benny, an old-timer who'd been driving trucks since before I was born and had this philosophical approach to life that made him the perfect person for a mission that required both physical labor and emotional support from someone who'd seen enough marriages fall apart to know when one was already over. I explained the situation in terms these guys would understand completely. My wife had basically told me to hit the road after months of prioritizing another man over our marriage, so I was going to do exactly that, and I needed a convoy to help execute the plan with military precision before she returned home expecting to find me waiting like a loyal dog who'd learned to accept whatever scraps of attention she felt like offering. These weren't the kind of men who wasted time with relationship counseling advice or attempts to talk me out of major decisions that had obviously been building for months. They just asked what time to show up and whether they should bring their own tools or use mine, treating this like any other job that needed to be completed efficiently and professionally. By midnight, we had assembled in my driveway like some kind of specialized moving crew, complete with Wyatt's pickup truck, Cole's borrowed van from his warehouse job, and Benny's personal truck that had seen more cross-country moves than a professional relocating company and could haul pretty much anything we needed to transport. We worked through the night with the systematic efficiency of a loading dock crew, carefully packing everything that belonged to me before marriage and leaving behind anything we'd purchased together as a couple, because I wasn't interested in fighting over material possessions with someone who'd already checked out of our relationship emotionally. I took my tools, my grandfather's antique compass that had guided him through World War II and had guided me through more than just geographical territory, family photos that featured only my relatives, and my collection of vintage truck memorabilia that Savannah had always dismissed as juvenile clutter, taking up valuable space in our spare room that could have been used for her yoga equipment or art supplies. The guys helped me wrap my electronics, box my clothes, and carefully transport my workshop equipment that represented years of careful purchases and weekend projects that Savannah had never shown any interest in understanding, always complaining about the noise when I worked on rebuilding engines or restoring vintage automotive parts. We left behind the expensive espresso machine she'd insisted we needed for sophisticated entertaining that never actually happened, the designer furniture we'd bought together during better times when she still pretended to care about building a home together, and even the television we'd purchased for the living room where I'd spent so many lonely evenings waiting for her to return from her freedom dancing sessions with Dominic. The hardest part wasn't deciding what to take. It was accepting how little of our shared life actually belonged to me in any meaningful way, and how much of our home had been decorated according to Savannah's vision while my preferences had been gradually eliminated over the years until I felt like a guest in my own house. Cole noticed the pattern too, commenting that our house looked like a magazine showroom rather than a place where a truck driver would feel comfortable relaxing after weeks on the road, and he was absolutely right about the sterile perfection that had replaced the comfortable mess of two people actually living together and making compromises for each other's happiness. The living room had become a showcase for Savannah's aesthetic preferences, with expensive throw pillows that couldn't be sat on, decorative items that served no practical purpose, and a color scheme that somehow managed to make me feel unwelcome in the space I'd been paying for. By 4 a.m, we'd loaded everything into the convoy of vehicles with the precision of a professional moving company, and I stood in what had been our bedroom taking one final inventory to make sure I wasn't forgetting anything important while also trying to process the strange relief I felt at leaving behind a life that had stopped feeling like mine months ago. The room looked different, already emptier but somehow more honest, without my belongings scattered around to create the illusion that this was a shared space rather than Savannah's domain that I'd been allowed to occupy as long as I didn't interfere with her newfound independence. I left my wedding ring on her nightstand next to a note that contained exactly 7 words. "You wanted freedom. So did I." The simplicity of that message felt perfect. No accusations, no emotional manipulation, no desperate attempts to explain my decision or justify my actions to someone who'd made it clear she valued her independence more than our marriage and her dance partner more than her husband. Wyatt offered to stay and help me write something longer or more detailed, but I knew that anything else would just be wasted words on someone who'd already checked out of our relationship emotionally months ago when Dominic became her primary source of excitement and validation. By sunrise, my entire life had been relocated to a storage unit across town, and I was sitting in Benny's truck drinking coffee from a thermos while watching our house disappear in the rearview mirror, feeling simultaneously exhausted and more alive than I'd felt in months of trying to compete with a fantasy relationship that existed only in Savannah's mind. The next morning, while Savannah was probably still sleeping off her latest freedom dancing adventure with Dominic, I was already at First National Bank opening a completely separate checking account that she'd never have access to, finally taking control of my financial future after months of funding a lifestyle that clearly didn't include me as anything more than a convenient source of income. I'd learned from years of trucking that when you're planning a major route change, you handle the logistics first and deal with the emotional aftermath later. So I spent the morning methodically severing every financial and legal connection that tied me to someone who'd made it clear she preferred another man's company to mine. My second stop was the law office of Patricia Coleman, an attorney who specialized in transportation industry cases and understood the unique challenges that truck drivers faced when their marriages fell apart while they were trying to maintain their careers and their dignity simultaneously. Patricia had a reputation for being both tough and fair, exactly the kind of representation I needed for dealing with someone who would probably try to paint me as the villain for taking her freedom advice seriously and acting on it immediately. I explained the situation honestly. My wife had been essentially dating her coworker while married to me, had dismissed my concerns as controlling behavior, and had finally told me to find my own freedom if I couldn't handle her need for independence, so I'd done exactly what she suggested. Patricia listened without judgment, took detailed notes, and explained that Tennessee was a no-fault divorce state, which meant we could dissolve the marriage without having to prove wrongdoing on either side, though Savannah's behavior with Dominic would certainly be relevant if she tried to claim spousal support or paint herself as the injured party. While I was signing paperwork and establishing my legal foundation, my phone started exploding with missed calls and increasingly frantic text messages from Savannah, who had apparently returned home to discover that I'd taken her freedom suggestion completely seriously and disappeared along with everything that belonged to me. The progression of her messages told the whole story of someone who'd expected me to sit around indefinitely waiting for her to finish exploring her options with other men, first confusion about where I'd gone, then anger that I'd left without explaining myself, then desperate attempts to frame my departure as an overreaction to what she tried to characterize as innocent friendship with Dominic. I read each message while sitting in Patricia's office, feeling a strange sense of vindication as I watched Savannah's panic escalate with each unanswered text, because for the first time in months she was experiencing the uncertainty and emotional abandonment that I'd been dealing with every Friday night when she chose Dominic's company over mine. Her calls came every few minutes, and I could almost picture her pacing around our empty house trying to figure out how her perfect arrangement had suddenly collapsed, probably calling Dominic to complain about my unreasonable behavior and get the emotional support she'd been seeking from him instead of her actual husband. Patricia advised me to document everything but avoid responding until we'd established clear boundaries about communication, because responding to Savannah's emotional manipulation would just encourage more of the same desperate behavior that had probably worked on previous boyfriends who didn't have the backbone to walk away from someone who treated relationships like a competition. By noon, I'd blocked Savannah's number along with her sister Melody and her mother, who had apparently been recruited into some kind of intervention campaign designed to guilt me into returning to a marriage that existed primarily for Savannah's convenience rather than any genuine partnership between equals. The beauty of blocking her entire family was that I no longer had to listen to their version of events, which would inevitably cast Savannah as the innocent victim of my sudden cruel abandonment rather than acknowledging that she'd spent months prioritizing another man over her marriage and had literally told me to find my own freedom when I objected to the arrangement. That afternoon brought the most interesting development of all, a call from Dominic himself, who claimed he'd had no idea that Savannah was married to someone who actually cared about her well-being and wanted to apologize for any misunderstanding about the nature of their relationship. His voice sounded genuinely surprised and more than a little panicked, like he was just now realizing that their freedom dancing sessions had real consequences beyond providing him with an ego boost and her with an escape from the reality of being married to someone she'd grown tired of. Dominic explained that Savannah had told him I was emotionally unavailable and that our marriage was basically over anyway, so he'd assumed their dancing and late-night conversations were helping her transition out of a relationship that she described as suffocating and controlling. The irony was almost amusing. While I'd been working my ass off driving trucks to support our household, Savannah had been painting me as the villain to justify her emotional affair with someone who probably would have run for the hills months ago if he'd known she was using him to blow up a real marriage. I listened to Dominic's nervous apologies and excuses with growing amusement, because it was obvious that once the fantasy of their forbidden romance collided with the reality of actual consequences, his enthusiasm for being Savannah's dance partner had evaporated completely, leaving her without either the husband she'd taken for granted or the alternative relationship she'd thought was waiting to replace me. Savannah's desperation escalated dramatically when she realized that blocking her calls wouldn't stop her from trying every manipulative tactic she'd ever learned to force me back into a conversation I had no interest in having with someone who'd made her priorities crystal clear months ago. 2 days after I'd moved out, she showed up at the trucking company depot during my shift change, forcing security to escort her off the property after she tried to convince the dispatcher that we had a family emergency requiring immediate contact with me. The security guard later told me she'd been screaming about how I was being unreasonable and cruel, demanding that someone make me talk to her because she had important things to explain about the misunderstanding regarding her relationship with Dominic, as if months of choosing another man's company over mine could be cleared up with a simple conversation. The irony was perfect. The woman who'd spent months dismissing my concerns as controlling behavior was now trying to control my workplace and force me into a conversation on her terms, apparently unable to comprehend that I might have genuinely moved on from caring about her explanations or excuses for behavior that spoke louder than any words she could offer. After the depot incident failed to get my attention, she tracked down Wyatt's address and spent an entire Saturday afternoon camped outside his apartment building, waiting for me to show up so she could ambush me with whatever reconciliation speech she'd prepared during the sleepless nights that followed her realization that I'd actually taken her freedom advice seriously. Wyatt called me around noon to report that my crazy ex-wife was sitting in her car in his parking lot, apparently planning to wait indefinitely for me to appear so she could force the dramatic confrontation she'd been denied when I'd simply disappeared instead of engaging in the emotional warfare she'd expected and probably rehearsed in her mind. I told Wyatt I'd be avoiding his place until she gave up and went home, because I had no intention of giving Savannah the satisfaction of seeing how much healthier and happier I looked without her constant criticism and emotional manipulation dragging me down every single day. When sitting outside Wyatt's apartment didn't produce the desired result, Savannah began using different phone numbers to bypass the blocks I'd established, calling from her work phone, her sister's phone, and even random numbers that belonged to friends who'd apparently been recruited into her campaign to force me back into a relationship that had died the moment she'd chosen Dominic's company over mine. Each voicemail followed the same predictable pattern: first anger about my childish behavior and refusal to communicate like an adult, then attempts at guilt manipulation about abandoning our marriage without giving her a chance to explain her side of the story, then promises that she'd end her friendship with Dominic if I'd just come home and work things out like mature married people who'd invested years in building something together. Patricia had warned me that this escalation was typical behavior from someone who'd lost control of a situation they'd assumed they could manage indefinitely, and she advised me to document every attempt at contact while maintaining complete radio silence to avoid encouraging further harassment or giving Savannah any reason to believe her tactics were working. The most pathetic attempt came when Savannah tried to claim she was pregnant, leaving a sobbing voicemail about how I was abandoning my child and destroying our family just because I couldn't handle her having male friends who understood her creative needs better than I did, conveniently forgetting that understanding her creative needs had apparently involved late-night dancing sessions and emotional intimacy that she'd never shared with her actual husband. I actually laughed out loud listening to that particular message, because I knew it was completely impossible given our lack of intimacy for the past several months and her religious devotion to birth control that she'd never miss taking even once in the years we'd been married, always making a big show of taking her pill at exactly the same time every morning. Patricia documented the false pregnancy claim as evidence of Savannah's increasingly desperate emotional manipulation tactics, noting that fabricating pregnancy to force reconciliation was a classic move from someone who'd run out of legitimate arguments for why their behavior had been acceptable and their marriage worth preserving. The pregnancy lie backfired spectacularly when I had Patricia send a formal letter requesting medical documentation of the supposed pregnancy, which resulted in Savannah finally admitting through her sister that she'd exaggerated the situation in a moment of emotional desperation, effectively destroying any credibility she might have had left. After the pregnancy scam collapsed, I decided it was time for the nuclear option and changed my phone number entirely, sharing the new contact information only with my employer, my family, Patricia, and the handful of friends I trusted completely to keep their mouths shut about my whereabouts and communication details. The piece that followed was absolutely incredible. No more frantic calls at all hours, no more guilt-trip voicemails, no more attempts to drag me back into the emotional chaos that Savannah had mistaken for passion and excitement in our relationship. The confrontation I'd been expecting finally arrived during a family barbecue at my parents' house in the suburbs of Memphis, where I'd been enjoying the kind of peaceful Sunday afternoon that had been impossible during the final months of my marriage when every family gathering had been overshadowed by Savannah's complaints about how boring my relatives were compared to her sophisticated creative friends like Dominic. I was helping my father with the grill and actually relaxing for the first time in months when my mother appeared at the back door with a concerned expression, announcing that Savannah and her sister Melody had just pulled into the driveway and were walking up to the front porch like they'd been invited to join our family celebration. My immediate instinct was to escape through the back gate, but my father put his hand on my shoulder and reminded me that this was our house and our family time, and if Savannah wanted to create a scene, she could do it in front of people who'd already heard the whole story and weren't impressed by her victim act. I walked through the house to find Savannah and Melody standing in our living room looking like they'd dressed for a funeral, with Savannah's eyes red from crying and Melody wearing the self-righteous expression of someone who'd been appointed to speak for the innocent party in this terrible misunderstanding. Savannah immediately launched into a rehearsed speech about how much she missed me and how sorry she was for not appreciating what we had together, while Melody nodded along like a backup singer providing moral support for what was obviously a carefully planned intervention designed to guilt me into returning to a marriage that had been dead for months. I listened quietly while Savannah explained that her friendship with Dominic had been completely innocent and that she'd only spent so much time with him because she was feeling neglected and unappreciated in our marriage, conveniently forgetting to mention that I'd been working my ass off to support our household while she was out dancing for freedom with another man. When she finished her prepared remarks and looked at me expectantly, I calmly explained that she'd had numerous opportunities over the past several months to address my concerns about boundaries, to suggest marriage counseling, or to prioritize our relationship over her need for validation from other men, but she'd chosen instead to dismiss my feelings and tell me to find my own freedom if I couldn't handle her independence. Melody immediately jumped in with accusations about my cruelty and unwillingness to forgive honest mistakes. But I pointed out that Savannah had only begun trying to save our marriage after Dominic had distanced himself from the situation and she'd realized that her backup plan wasn't going to materialize into the exciting new relationship she'd been hoping for. My mother, who'd been watching the whole exchange from the kitchen doorway, finally spoke up to say that any woman who'd treat her son the way Savannah had treated me wasn't welcome in her home to demand forgiveness and second chances that hadn't been earned through any genuine change in behavior or attitude. The conversation became increasingly uncomfortable as Savannah's composure cracked and she started crying about how unfair it was that I wouldn't even try to work things out, apparently forgetting that I'd spent months trying to work things out while she was prioritizing her emotional connection with Dominic over any consideration for her husband's feelings. My father joined the conversation at that point, speaking in the calm, measured tone he'd used when I was a teenager making bad decisions, explaining that he'd raised me to value commitment and respect in relationships, and that watching me tolerate months of disrespect and emotional abandonment had been painful for the entire family. When Savannah demanded to know why everyone was taking my side without hearing her version of events, my mother pointed out that we'd all witnessed her behavior firsthand during family gatherings where she'd spent more time texting with Dominic than participating in conversations with people who'd welcomed her as family. The intervention ended with Savannah and Melody leaving in tears, but not before Melody accused me of throwing away years of marriage over jealousy and insecurity, which actually made me laugh because the woman defending Savannah's right to prioritize another man over her husband was lecturing me about insecurity. After they left, my family gathered around the kitchen table to debrief the confrontation, and my father told me he was proud of how I'd handled the situation with dignity and clarity, never raising my voice or stooping to personal attacks despite the obvious emotional manipulation I'd been subjected to for the past hour. The legal proceedings moved forward with surprising efficiency once Savannah realized that her dramatic appeals and family interventions had failed to shake my resolve, and she finally accepted that I was serious about ending our marriage rather than returning to the one-sided arrangement where I funded her lifestyle while she explored emotional connections with other men. Patricia had predicted that Savannah would eventually drop her demands for spousal support once she understood that fighting the divorce would only result in a detailed public examination of her relationship with Dominic, something that wouldn't reflect well on her character or her claims of being the innocent victim in our marriage's collapse. The turning point came when Patricia's office received a call from Savannah's attorney indicating that she was prepared to accept the standard separation terms without contesting any of the asset division, probably because she'd realized that her behavior with Dominic had eliminated any sympathy a judge might have had for her financial situation. Within 2 weeks, we'd reached a settlement that gave me back my freedom without the financial devastation that often accompanies divorce proceedings, and I was able to move forward with rebuilding my life on my own terms rather than spending months in courtrooms relitigating the obvious fact that she'd checked out of our marriage emotionally long before I'd physically left the house. I used the money from selling my share of our shared possessions to put a down payment on a modest 2-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood outside Memphis, far enough from our old life together that I wouldn't risk running into Savannah or any reminders of the years I'd wasted trying to make someone happy who was fundamentally incapable of appreciating genuine commitment and partnership. The house was nothing fancy, a simple ranch-style home with a small yard and a garage where I could work on truck maintenance projects without bothering neighbors or dealing with homeowners association complaints about the noise. Moving into my own space felt like breathing freely for the first time in years, especially when I realized I could decorate according to my own preferences without having to compromise with someone who considered my interests juvenile and embarrassing compared to her sophisticated aesthetic sensibilities. I bought practical furniture that was comfortable rather than impressive, hung my vintage truck photos on the walls without worrying about whether they fit some magazine-perfect design scheme, and set up a workshop in the garage where I could pursue my hobbies without apologizing for taking up space or making noise that disturbed someone's meditation or creative process. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday morning 6 months after I'd walked out of our marriage, and I signed them at my new kitchen table while drinking coffee from my own coffee maker, feeling a sense of closure that was both satisfying and anticlimactic. There was no drama, no final confrontation, no last-minute attempt by Savannah to change my mind, just legal documentation that officially ended what had been dead for months before I'd finally acknowledged reality and acted accordingly. That afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number that I almost deleted without reading, but curiosity got the better of me and I opened what turned out to be Savannah's final message acknowledging that I deserved better treatment throughout our marriage and that she was sorry for the pain she'd caused by prioritizing her own desires over our partnership. I stared at the message for several minutes, recognizing it as probably genuine remorse rather than another manipulation tactic, but ultimately responding with just 4 words that summed up everything I'd learned about my own worth over the past 6 months. I simply wrote back that I knew I deserved better, which was exactly why I'd chosen freedom when she'd offered it to me that night. She told me to find my own independence instead of trying to control her need for validation from other men. Looking back on the whole experience, I realized I'd transformed from someone who would have fought desperately to save a marriage that was already over into someone who recognized his own value and refused to accept less than he deserved from any relationship, romantic or otherwise. 1 year after the divorce papers were signed, I was living a completely different life that bore no resemblance to the exhausting emotional roller coaster I'd endured during the final months of my marriage to someone who'd mistaken drama and uncertainty for passion and excitement. The transformation had been gradual but profound, starting with my promotion to senior dispatcher at the trucking company, a position that came with both increased responsibility and a substantial raise that reflected the respect I'd earned from colleagues who'd witnessed my professionalism during the personal chaos of my divorce proceedings. My new role involved coordinating routes for long-haul drivers across the Southeast, work that required the same attention to detail and crisis management skills that had served me well during the breakdown of my marriage, except now I was solving problems for people who appreciated my efforts instead of someone who resented them as evidence of my controlling nature. The house had become a real home over the months, furnished with pieces I'd chosen carefully rather than purchased hastily to fill empty rooms, each item selected because it served a purpose or brought me genuine satisfaction rather than impressing visitors who never came anyway. My workshop in the garage had evolved into a fully equipped space where I restored vintage truck parts and worked on mechanical projects that connected me to the practical skills my father had taught me, skills that Savannah had always dismissed as blue-collar hobbies unworthy of someone with sophisticated creative aspirations like herself. The social isolation that had characterized the final year of my marriage had been replaced by genuine friendships with people who shared my interests and values, starting with my co-workers at the trucking company and expanding to include neighbors who appreciated my mechanical expertise and willingness to help with practical problems that didn't require expensive professional solutions. I'd started hosting monthly poker games at my house, events that would have been impossible during my marriage because Savannah had considered my friends beneath the intellectual level of the artistic crowd she'd cultivated through her job and her relationship with Dominic. These gatherings had become the highlight of my social calendar, featuring the kind of straightforward masculine camaraderie that I'd missed desperately during years of trying to fit into Savannah's world of pretentious creative types who treated practical skills and honest work as evidence of limited imagination and ambition. Cole had become a regular at these poker nights, along with Wyatt and Benny, creating the foundation of a support network that had sustained me through the difficult transition from married life to independence, and their presence in my home felt natural and comfortable in ways that Savannah's artistic friends never had. The conversations at these gatherings covered everything from work challenges to family relationships to dating adventures, topics that were discussed with the kind of honest directness that had been impossible in my marriage, where every opinion had to be filtered through Savannah's judgment about whether my thoughts were sophisticated enough for someone of her elevated creative sensibilities. During one particularly memorable evening, Wyatt had brought up the subject of my dating life, suggesting that it was time for me to get back out there and find someone who would appreciate what I had to offer instead of treating me like a convenient source of financial support and emotional labor. I'd explained that I wasn't in any hurry to jump back into a serious relationship, having learned to enjoy the peace and predictability of life without someone who required constant validation and drama to feel fulfilled, but I wasn't completely opposed to meeting someone whose values aligned more closely with my own. The conversation had led to Benny's observation that the right woman would enhance my already satisfying life rather than demanding that I reconstruct it around her needs and preferences, an insight that reflected the hard-won wisdom of someone who'd witnessed enough relationship disasters to recognize the difference between healthy partnership and emotional parasitism. That evening had marked a turning point in my thinking about the future, helping me realize that I'd spent years accommodating someone whose vision of marriage involved one person sacrificing their identity and preferences to support the other person's journey of self-discovery and creative fulfillment. The contrast between my current life and the exhausting uncertainty of my marriage became crystal clear during a conversation with my mother, who'd commented on how much healthier and happier I looked compared to the stressed, defensive person I'd been during the final months with Savannah. She'd pointed out that I'd stopped apologizing for my interests and opinions, stopped trying to justify my career choices and lifestyle preferences to people who would never appreciate them anyway, and started building a life that reflected my actual values rather than someone else's vision of what I should become. My mother's observations had helped me understand that Savannah's demand for freedom to dance through life had been code for her desire to explore other options while maintaining the financial and emotional security of marriage, and that her anger about my departure had been less about losing me specifically than about losing the comfortable arrangement that allowed her to have everything she wanted without consequences. The realization that I'd been treated as a safety net rather than a partner had initially been painful, but over time it had evolved into a source of strength and clarity about what I would and wouldn't accept in any future relationship. I'd learned to value my own peace of mind above the excitement of trying to win someone's affection, understanding that genuine love didn't require constant effort to prove my worthiness or accommodate behavior that disrespected our commitment. The Friday evenings that had once been defined by sitting alone while Savannah prepared for her freedom dancing sessions with Dominic had been transformed into opportunities for personal projects, social activities with friends who actually wanted my company, or simply peaceful relaxation that didn't depend on anyone else's approval or participation. I discovered that contentment was possible without the drama and uncertainty that Savannah had convinced me were necessary components of an exciting relationship, and that stability and mutual respect were far more valuable than the emotional roller coaster she'd mistaken for passion. The most satisfying aspect of my new life was the absence of walking on eggshells around someone who might interpret any expression of my needs or preferences as an attack on her independence and creativity, and the freedom to make decisions based on my own judgment rather than constantly calculating how my choices might affect someone else's mood or self-image. I'd started taking weekend trips to places I'd always wanted to visit but had avoided because Savannah had considered them boring or beneath her sophisticated tastes, and these solo adventures had reminded me of the simple pleasure of exploring new places without having to manage someone else's expectations or entertainment needs. The financial freedom that came with no longer subsidizing someone else's lifestyle had allowed me to build genuine savings for the first time in years, and I'd started making concrete plans for the future that didn't depend on anyone else's approval or participation. I'd even begun considering the possibility of starting my own small trucking business, a dream that had been impossible during my marriage because Savannah had considered entrepreneurship too risky and preferred the security of my steady employment that funded her artistic pursuits and social activities. The final chapter of my story with Savannah had been written not through dramatic confrontation or bitter recrimination, but through the simple recognition that some people are incapable of appreciating genuine partnership and commitment, and that the kindest thing you can do for everyone involved is to give them exactly what they ask for when they tell you they want freedom. Looking ahead, I felt optimistic about eventually finding someone who would value the qualities that Savannah had taken for granted, someone who would see my reliability and commitment as strengths rather than limitations, and who would want to build something together rather than using our relationship as a launching pad for exploring other possibilities. But for now, I was content with the life I'd built from scratch, surrounded by people who appreciated my friendship and respected my choices, living in a space that reflected my preferences and values, and working toward goals that mattered to me rather than someone else's vision of what my life should look like. The greatest lesson from my marriage and divorce had been learning to recognize my own worth and refuse to accept less than I deserved, whether from a romantic partner or anyone else who wanted the benefits of my loyalty and commitment without offering the same in return. Sometimes the best response to someone demanding their freedom is to give it to them completely and permanently, then use your own newfound freedom to build something infinitely better than what you left behind.